So I'm pretty sure that Joe already knows this, but for anybody else who happens to get involved in this discussion, to give a little background, I actually recently graduated with a BA in psychology, and I don't regret it yet, though I must say the psychology that I learned in the classroom um, was interesting at times. Neuropsychology was interesting, cognitive psychology was interesting, but most of the psychology classes I took were behaviorism oriented, meaning very materialistic, and they didn't deal with the psyche at all. They dealt with the behavior of human beings, the development of human beings, but largely in a developmental, or excuse me, in a biological sense. You know, primary, secondary sex characteristics, and the behaviors that are the result of that. We did talk about Piaget and you know, some aspects of consciousness and the development of awareness, but very minimally. So the psychology taught in academia is very neglectful of the psyche. It's more concerned with behaviors. Most of the psychology that I enjoyed was Carl Jung, Freud, even um, Adler, and Maslow, and guys that don't really get talked about much in the classroom, um, or at least not in the mainstream state universities. Certainly, there are smaller institutions everywhere across the world where you can go to become a Jungian analyst, for example. Um, but just to give a little insight into what it was like in the classroom, um, the Intro to Psychology class, which I actually never had to take, but one of my roommates took. The textbook was written by the professor, and Carl Jung is mentioned, but only one sentence to say basically, if you think Freud's ideas are crazy, then don't even, you know, think about looking into Carl Jung, because most people consider his ideas religious or mystical. And whenever an academic text calls something mystical, it's a term used in a derogatory sense. But I definitely can understand why some people would perceive the harms of these fields, psychology and psychiatry, because they do have a tendency to be a bit reductionistic about the nature of the human psyche. And so some of their solutions or prescriptions or diagnoses of your condition may be not only false, but in some sense immoral, or infringing upon your rights as a unique human being. Um, and certainly, if you look at like in the 50s, when thousands and thousands of people across the country were misdiagnosed and locked up in institutions, and given electroshock therapy and given lobotomies, and basically we were just destroying their ability to ever return to normalcy. And even today, the way that mainstream psychology looks at disorders like schizophrenia is very interesting, because there's a tendency to localize the disease in the individual. But so often, schizophrenia is more the result of the environment from which the individual has been taken, or the environment in which he has been raised. Um, so certainly there are fears, but like I said, there is uh, a broad range of psychological perspectives to take, and I think Carl Jung is really a great example of what psychology is capable of. You mentioned that there are short-term approaches to psychology, which we use typically more than the long-term approaches, or approaches which benefit us in a deeper sense than just surface gratification. And a lot of behaviorist psychology is short term. I think a lot of um, psychiatry, where instead of really engaging and facing the existential issues of the person's life, what they're neglecting, what they're unconscious of, the psychiatrist will just prescribe Prozac or Zoloft or some kind of um, serotonin reuptake inhibitor to fix the chemicals, because if we are going to approach the human being as a body rather than a psyche, then, well, that's obviously the first step we're going to take, is we're going to correct the imbalance of the body. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's just that's one very limited perspective to take, especially when we are psychologists. We're supposed to be paying attention to the human psyche, and that's more of a long-term approach when we start to pay attention to the psyche, because we're moving or attempting to move the individual toward individuation, and that is a process which involves more than just eating healthy. It's almost an engagement with the culture in such a deep way, because for Jung, the unconscious was collective, and that's different than Freud, because Freud thought the unconscious was individual. It was based on your individual sexual needs and desires. Whereas Jung saw that, yes, that is an aspect of the unconscious, of the personal unconscious, but there is a vast and far deeper unconscious which doesn't know separation between individuals. And it's sort of this repository of archetypes and symbols that Jung admitted were probably biologically founded and reflected in the structure of the brain and the rest of the body. But that doesn't mean that there isn't this psyche, this higher order property, which has obviously appeared on the scene, even though it may appear to be nothing but a body. It is still here, and we have to deal with it as human beings if we're going to acknowledge every facet of our lives, not just what we can see and feel out here in the world, but what we can taste and smell and experience inside. They're both real phenomena, and I think Jung was quite aware of that, and a lot of mainstream, more scientific behaviorist psychology wants to deny that that is there, because it really does complicate the matter. It makes it so you can't be very reductionistic about explaining anything, because Jung, a psychologist like Jung, can't explain how the mind works in one simple formula as a behaviorist may be able to. All Jung can provide is a method of coping with the unconscious, coming to understand the unconscious. You can never control it. You can understand it and relate to it in a more pragmatic way, a deeper way. And that's why I'm interested in Buddhism too. It seems to be a type of psychology, though not a Western science, but an Eastern method of transforming consciousness. You could say moving one towards individuation or self-realization. And meditation is certainly a great way to combat anger, for example, because when you are able to focus your mind in such a way that you become such an observer of the phenomenon of your psyche and your body, that you no longer mistake your experience for something which could be controlled, or that it's worth getting angry over, as though anything were happening to some self in here, some vulnerable ego. When you meditate, that thesis no longer holds any weight, because the ego just disappears, and then there is no one to get angry. And it's not just some words that you're trying to convince this angry person about why anger is bad. They know, and they agree. It's actually a method for showing them firsthand it's not even possible to be angry. once you've seen through the ego and seen that there's no substantiality there, what are you angry at? There's no subject to be angry at an object. So anger is always misplaced, I think. Um, it's always a self delusion. It's never warranted.